Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Egyptians have started voting in their second and final round of the country's constitutional referendum, and police in Pennsylvania say they have no motive for why a man shot and killed a woman at a Christmas party yesterday, then left and killed 2 men before finally being shot dead by police. The shooting happened about the same time the NRA held its press conference in Washington, D.C. We're going to have more on the NRA in just a moment. Right now, I am joined by Ta-Nehisi Coates, senior editor for The Atlantic magazine, Haley Elkins, author of a recent piece for the website Exojane, How a Gun-Loving Texas Girl Learned to Fear Assault Weapons, Rich Lucibella, owner and publisher of S.W.A.T magazine, Survival Weapons and Tactics, and Jackie Hilley, executive director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. Great to have all here this morning. All right, the NRA broke its week of silence following the Newtown, Connecticut shooting in a big way yesterday. They had promised, quote, meaningful contributions to help stop gun violence, but in a press conference in which the organization took no questions, Executive Vice President and CEO Wayne LaPierre's only concrete policy contribution seemed to be his call for armed guards inside all of the nation's schools.
I call on Congress today to act immediately to appropriate whatever is necessary to put armed police officers in every single school in this nation, and to do it now, to make sure that blanket safety is in place when our kids return to school in January.
For 30 minutes, LaPierre went on a diatribe that was steadfast, unyielding, an attempt to blame violence on things like video games and the unknown number of insane monsters who, in his words, populate our society. But what it turned into was a glimpse inside the mind of the man who makes the NRA, the lobbying arm of the firearms industry, tick. It was easily the most riveting, chilling, and revealing spectacle at a national press conference than I can remember.
How many more copycats are waiting in the wings for their moment of fame? How can we possibly even guess how many, given our nation's refusal to create an active national database of the mentally ill? Add another hurricane, terrorist attack, or some other natural or man-made disaster, and you've got a recipe for a national nightmare. Vicious, violent video games, 1,000 music videos. Isn't fantasizing about killing people as a way to get your kicks really the filthiest form of pornography? Throughout it all, too many in the national media, their corporate owners, and their stockholders act as silent enablers, if not complicit co-conspirators. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Well, I have to say, I thought this was really an insane spectacle, this press conference. And I went into it thinking 2 things. One, I thought the NRA would take a page out of the Wall Street post-crisis playbook. Wall Street post-crisis said, look, we get it. It was a big crisis, and we need some regulation, definitely. And they gave lip service to that, and they even said, we're going to work with you on regulation. And then behind the scenes, in the lobbying, in the back rooms, they were able to gut a lot of that regulation and put in loopholes. And this seemed like a really smart strategic approach on the part of Wall Street, because they were able to reap the PR benefits publicly of saying, yes, of course we need regulation, and also escape the worst of the actual, real constraining effects of actual regulation. And I was expecting a similar kind of approach from the NRA, and that was clearly not at all the approach taken. Were you surprised, Rich? Was that what you were expecting?
Well, I think I expected, yes, the NRA to be more political, to take a more political approach. And I think what LaPierre did was he took a more practical approach. And I think that if we tease apart what he was saying, sometimes because we don't particularly appreciate the speaker, we don't hear the message. And I think that there was some value in what he was saying. He was not just talking about armed security in schools. He was talking about redundant security for schools, if you will. And he was talking about providing grants to do audits for access to schools, for construction of schools, and to the extent that, he brought up the media and the way we give these little monsters attention and the way we give them an identity by mentioning their names and repeating their names helps to create additional little monsters. We find that these types of crimes occur in clusters, and so to that extent, LaPierre is not that far off when he says how many are out there waiting. We have no idea.
The data, we looked into the data on this sort of copycat effect, and there's been really interesting findings in both directions. It's fairly unsettled. There's been some findings that do suggest there is a kind of copycat effect, that large publicity of mass shootings induces people who may be on the border of committing this sort of thing to plan them. There's other survey data that says that maybe not the case. The thing that I found interesting, one place just concretely about this was the sort of focus on schools, and I understand why there's a focus on schools, because that's why this act was so horrifying. But schools are very safe places. I just want to show this graph because I think this is important to just put this. This is homicides in elementary and high schools over the years. And, what you see is there are not a lot of people killed in schools in America. Every time someone is killed in a school in America, it is a horrific tragedy. But in terms of what are our social problems, schools themselves as sites of violence are not the thing that is not really the problem in terms of what the data say. And I felt like it was, in focusing on the schools, that was maybe missing the problem, Ta-Nehisi.
Yeah, and I think also it's very important to understand that self-defense does not begin at the moment of conflict. There is collective self-defense. There's self-defense that a society enables through regulations, through laws that it passes, through norms that it tries to establish. And one of the big things that I think is missing from this debate, I mean, we can go back and forth and have a conversation about whether armed security would, stop anything from happening, didn't help in Columbine. But the bigger question is, we as a society, what does it say when you want to put more guns in your place of education, in your place where you send your 5, 6, 7-year-old children? Is that the message? Is that the sort of society that we actually want to be? Or do we want to take self-defense before the moment of conflict? Do we want to look at legislation? Do we want to put policies in place that allow us to defend ourselves before we get to a point where we say, I wish that teacher had an M4? By the time you get to that point, it's too late.
Haley, were you surprised by the tone of the press conference?
I had been very optimistic about the NRA's statement all week, waiting for it, the official statement. And then I have to say I was very disappointed. I think that their statement was a pretty huge disservice to their membership. And I know wonderful members of the NRA who have fantastic expertise, are very smart, could be wonderful resources in this, and I really think that statement did not reflect any sort of an engaging in discourse and an engaging in dialogue. I was shocked at how much of a monologue it was, actually.
There's this emerging idea, and I think it's an emerging idea that's like sort of a hopeful idea in liberal circles, so I want to sort of reality check it, that there's this gap between the NRA and its membership, right? This is something, you'll see the statistic about polling about specific regulatory initiatives. And I'm just curious how much you think, Haley and Rich, how much you think that is the case. And this is something that exists, across the ideological spectrum, right? Large, particularly beltway-based interest groups pursuing an agenda will sometimes have divisions from their constituencies or memberships, and this happens on the left, it happens on the right, as a sort of organizational fact. And I'm curious what your feeling is on that, Haley.
Well, I was raised in the sort of 1970s, for lack of a better term, style of thinking about the NRA when they were still having a lot more dialogue and a lot more discourse than perhaps they are now. And I was also raised with the mentality of them not being a lobby organization, but being a resource of education and training for their members, and being kind of a collective resource. And then when I became a young, kind of an adult woman, I realized that was not the situation that we were looking at with a lobbying arm like that.
So I think one of the things that we need to look at that happened this week is the way that all the issues were defined by the NRA press conference was around the issue of gun-free schools. So as you brought out, schools in this country are very, very safe. But in addition to that, the premise of that argument is if it weren't for the fact that we had said gun-free schools, there wouldn't be any shootings in schools. But we don't have national campaigns that say gun-free malls, malls, gun-free spas, gun-free religious institutions, gun-free streets. And so that doesn't stop the killers from getting there. The killers are, you know, coming there to do whatever they want to do, and it's the access to the guns that make whatever happens in their minds a possibility. So we should be talking about how we regulate who gets the guns, because I don't think it matters whether you're a member of the NRA or you've never touched a gun in your life. You don't want guns in the wrong hands.
Well, the wrong hands, I think, is the key thing. But before we get to the regulation question, I just want to talk about gun culture, for lack of a better word, because I do think at this moment we say, well, if you look at the international data, right, it's just a fact that America has more guns than anywhere else in the world in terms of its relative to its population. The next highest is Yemen, and we're almost double Yemen, right? So there's something different about the U.S. This is American exceptionalism in one form or the other, and I want to talk to you two particularly about why that is right after we take this break.
We can immediately make America's schools safer. The National Rifle Association, as America's preeminent trainer of law enforcement and security personnel, for the past 50 years, we have 11,000 police training instructors in the NRA, is ready, willing, and uniquely qualified to help. Our training programs are the most advanced in the world. That expertise must be brought to bear to protect our schools and our children now. The NRA is going to bring all its knowledge, all its dedication, and all its resources to develop a model National School Shield Emergency Response Program for every single school in America that wants it.
That's the NRA's Wayne LaPierre talking about the SHIELD program yesterday at yesterday's press conference. Rich, here's a question I want to ask you. There's two trends that I think are interesting, and Jackie, you pointed this out last weekend when you were on the show, which is, one is the total number of guns in the U.S. in household hands is increasing, at the same time that the percentage of households that have guns is decreasing. And so you have a situation in which a smaller, it's still very widely held. I think 40% of all married households have a firearm in the home, but it's been going like this, whereas the amount of guns have been going like that. And so it seems like we're on a trajectory in which more and more guns are in fewer and fewer hands. And I wonder how you think the culture around firearm ownership is changing right now in this country, or has been over, say, the last 10 years, or where it's going from now.
I think that there is a natural decline to some extent due to population moving into urban centers, and the regulation within those areas, and the difficulty in obtaining concealed weapons permits in places like New York and places like Chicago. But I don't know that I agree that the percentage of households owning guns is decreasing. I think that there may be some underreporting there, because we see every time there's one of these tragedies in Newtown, Connecticut, there's a run on firearms.
Yes. Across the country. I mean, we have places reporting highest single-day sales on record.
And they're also reporting highest first purchase sales on record. So people are understanding the fact that that to an extent, LaPierre is right. Once we've missed on our first, second, and third redundant areas of security, and it comes to guns, the only thing that can stop a guy with a gun, a bad guy with a gun, is a good guy with a gun.
Isn't that a totally dystopian vision? I mean, I saw this yesterday. If where we're headed, if the solution is, look, just arm everyone, I mean...
That's not the solution.
Well, but if the solution is the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, then, and we say we're going to miss these redundancies, then the idea of putting more and more weapons in more and more people's hands, particularly if you're not there's no training, right? There's no licensing.
Oh,
I mean,
no,
if you just,
training.
if you just, no, but there's no requirement for it. I mean, I'm just saying, if
concealed weapons, concealed carry permit, there is.
Not everywhere. There's not at all. It's very erratic in terms of the.
It can be erratic. It can be erratic. There are certain states that don't require a concealed weapons permit at all. I agree.
But here's my question: the psychological part of this. This I think is important to me, which is like the idea of safety, like gun as a means of self-defense, right? There seems to be there's a few reasons people have guns. There's shooting as a recreational activity. There's hunting as a recreational activity. There's home defense, right? The idea that like I'm going to have a loaded weapon in my house because if someone breaks in, I want to defend my house. And then there's this kind of vision of just the enjoyment of interfacing with the weapon and the gear and training yourself. And I'm wondering how, Haley, something you want to say about the sort of psychology of all this?
Well, because I'm not by any means an expert on firearms, but what pushed me to write this article was the kind of vitriol that we were seeing in the gun debate, for lack of a better term. And what upset me was that we keep referring to gun culture in America as if it's this monolithic ideal, and gun means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And West Texas gun culture is very different than St. Louis inner city gun culture, which is very different than Los Angeles and Miami gun culture. So to that point, I think that the only place you have meaningful discourse comes out of the middle. And that's not because the middle is moderate. That's because that's the only place that people are talking. So when what you want to do is you want to have a set of dialogue in the middle, because what we saw was a dueling set of monologues on either side, and they were very, very loud, and everybody was shouting, and it's physically impossible to think and shout at the same time.
Will you tell me for viewers that haven't read this article, just walk us through the basics of what you wrote about.
Well, I realized after Connecticut, and I was having this very visceral reaction to how angry everybody was on both sides, I realized that guns have been present in my life growing up in West Texas at a lot of different milestones. All of my milestone moments have had guns present in them in some form or fashion, or most of them have. And then I realized, having married a man from inner city Cincinnati who had never had any interaction with guns before, ever, never even seen one in real life, let alone held one and used one, that was a very different upbringing and a very different scope from a lot of people. And my milestone interaction with guns have been a lot of positive and a lot of negative ones, obviously. And so that inspired me to talk about the gap between my husband and I, because I thought it represented pretty well the gap between the nation when we talk about gun culture as being a monolithic thing, and of course it's not.
You grew up, Ta-Nehisi, in Baltimore, and you've written about gun culture there. I want you to talk about that right after we take a break. Sure. Ta-Nehisi, Haley just said that I think it's a really important point that how we think about guns and our relationship to guns are very different based on where you're coming from and how you grew up. And I'm curious where you're coming from, having grown up in Baltimore, how you think about guns.
Right, well, there were two things. I mean, I grew up in Baltimore in the 80s and late 90s where gun violence was just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, just off the charts. At the same time, I'm African-American. I come from a very politicized African-American family. My dad was in the Black Panther Party. The poster of Malcolm X with the M1 was very popular when I was young. And I don't say that just to talk about cosmetic things. I say that to say the notion of self-defense is very important to me and was very important in the community that I grew up in. So when people talk about, the desire or in fact, the need, I would go so far as to say to have a gun in the house because you don't know when the cops are going to be there. You don't know if they're going to get there in time. I'm very much connected to that. I really, really am. I have a great degree of sympathy and belief. If I did not live in New York, I might have a gun in my house. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but I might. So, I mean, when people talk about that, that. I'm totally there with you. But when you get to the point where you say there should be, no regulation or anything, any sort of limitation, when you start rolling back regulation, when you start getting to a point where it's easier for a felon to restore their gun rights than it is to restore their voting rights, then I begin to have a little bit of trouble. I think we're going beyond self-defense.
I'm glad you invoked the Black Panthers, because I wanted to make this point, because it was last weekend I was talking about right-to-work laws and their origins, which have some really unsavory origins, and essentially white supremacy in the South, and the fear about unions being a site of integration. But gun control, actually, fascinatingly, the first big piece of gun control legislation is introduced in 1967 after the Black Panthers show up at the California State Capitol with loaded weapons. And Ronald Reagan, who's the governor at the time, supports it. As the Black Panther strategy of armed self-defense became more and more effective at mobilizing members of the black community, the Panthers attracted even greater attention among authorities. On April 5th, 1967, Assemblyman Mulford introduced a bill, AB 5091, in the California legislature, proposing to outlaw the carrying of loaded firearms in public. I should say that Ronald Reagan, governor at the time, supported that piece of legislation, even though he was the first official candidate the NRA endorsed when he ran.
And Chris, just to add on to that, I mean, just to understand where the Panthers were coming from in that period, immediately after slavery, in the period of Reconstruction, the first thing people do is they try to take the guns out of the African American community so that the community can then be disempowered and oppressed. So what I'm saying is there's a natural sort of affinity for the notion that I have the right to secure myself among many African Americans, but we're going to a kind of maximalist
The history of this is very important. This is the Jim Crow laws, which is the original gun control throughout the South. The Jim Crow laws, which established all of the laws against ownership, against carry in certain places, came after the Civil War. They happened to be a Democratic Party institution.
Right.
And it's those laws that we've been fighting against in the concealed carry permit area for decades now.
But let me ask. Okay, so the context here to me seems important, and I should also note that in 1956, after his house was bombed, before he fully adopted Gandhian nonviolence, MLK applied for a permit to carry a concealed firearm in Montgomery, Alabama, because the local police chief had discretion over who could receive a permit. Decades earlier, the state had adopted the NRA-endorsed Uniform Firearms Act. King's application.
So did Senator Dianne Feinstein.
So here's my question. Explain to me why it is not. I'm asking you this honestly. I hear about someone who's got a whole bunch of firearms, okay, and spends a lot of time training with those firearms and thinking about how they're going to use them. And I cannot help but think there's something paranoid and creepy about that. That there's this apocalyptic sense of fear that we are not in post-Reconstruction South, right? I mean, the context here matters. Right. Freedmen in the post-Reconstruction South, right. MLK in the heart of Dixie in the 1950s. I mean, the context here is very different about when people have this psychology that seems to me quite paranoid. Explain to me why I am wrong about that.
That's relatively easy. I'm the publisher of a firearms magazine. Obviously, I have more than one or two weapons. Right. There are different purposes for different weapons. We own 22 caliber weapons for plinking and target practice in practice. We own shotguns for hunting, sporting clays, and self-defense, perhaps one by the bedside if you don't have children in the house, perhaps one in a vault. And we have handguns for personal protection for concealed carry. Now, does that make you a gun nut? I don't think so, but I do think this, that if you own those weapons, you damn sure better be trained and safe around them. I'm not talking about trained to kill somebody. I'm not talking about trained to use them in self-defense, though you should if that's what you purchase the gun for. I'm talking about trained to be safe around those firearms. And in order to be safe around those firearms, you have got to practice like anything else. You've got to go to a range. You have to, in your piece, Haley, you talked about you're a firearms owner your entire life, but you spoke about a Glock, a pistol, that it was that you took from somebody that the slowest move you ever made was unloading this, that you had to unload it based on how you saw your boyfriend unload it. Thumb, and it's open. Well, if she had trained received training with that firearm, she wouldn't have had that fear of having to unload it.
But, you know, let me just say this discussion, I think, is absolutely true, that anybody who has a firearm should be trained and should be very knowledgeable about how to keep it safely in your home and how to load it safely and unload it safely. The problem is there is no such requirement nationally, and there is no such requirement in most states. So once a person gets a hold of a gun, they don't have those requirements, and they can go into any old state and go to a gun show and buy very, very dangerous weapons. And just let's look at Mrs. Lanza. Let's look at the facts of the case of Mrs. Lanza. She's a person who bought her gun because she felt that she wanted protection, and she was very experienced.
And also enjoyed,
very knowledgeable,
enjoyed shooting.
Enjoyed all the historical things that you're talking about, and lived in an area where she could do it on a regular basis. And she was killed in her own home by her son. That is so frequently the case when guns go into the wrong hands. So the things that we're talking about, I hate to keep going back to the regulations, is like, who has the gun in the first place? What decision do we make around who gets the gun? And how do we regulate that sensibly?
Yeah.
That's really what we need to do.
I want to get your response to that right after we take this break. Talking about guns and gun culture and gun training and gun safety. Haley, there's something you wanted to say.
I was really struck by what you said about how we need to go back to the regulations. We need to talk about the regulations and what is the solution about who can and can't own a gun. And I think it bothers me that we're not having more of a conversation about what gun ownership looks like, and what every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. So what guns as tools look like and what guns as weapons look like. And it bothers me that my husband, who had never had any experience with a firearm, has now had more experience with firearms than I have, because he went out shooting with me, and then he went out with a bachelor party and shot multiple handguns and multiple an AK and a bunch of other things that had recoil modifications. And he is still just as pro gun control as he ever was, which is much more than I am. But the fabric of his understanding completely changed about what the difference was from firing my shotgun, which he had fired and was comfortable firing, to an AK.
Right. I mean, one of the things you say, and one of the things I think, the point you make in the piece, and I should just be clear about this, is the piece that it's about sort of recreational shooting with your parents. It's also about an abusive ex-boyfriend who held you at gunpoint.
Right. Correct.
And the difference in the experience of that the weapon in those contexts. One of the things you say in the piece is that you seem to sort of put a lot of it on the weapon itself in certain ways, right? That like what the weapon's designed to do, that like there's something about the weapon in the context of shooting. It's also the design and architecture of that item.
And well, here's something else I don't think we're talking about. We're looking at guns as inanimate objects, and they are. However, guns, just like people, every single one has a story. It has a story of everything that it's done. It has a story of everything it's capable of doing, and it has a story of what it may do in the future. And I don't think that we're having that sort of a discussion.
Well, we sort of are, right? Because, I mean, what we're talking about, here is exactly that, right? The Bushmaster, right, which has become now famous because it was the, there were two handguns, we should note, but it was the sort of rifle, I think it's called long rifle in the argot of the gun industry. This ad was used to sell the Bushmaster. And again, I keep wanting to not be swept up in my worst caricature stereotypes, but then I see something like this. This is the Bushmaster firearm campaign about getting your man card back. That like the way to buy the Bushmaster, the reason to buy, Colin F is just unmanly. Colin F avoids eye contact with a tough-looking fifth grader. His man card is revoked. Revoke a man card, and then when he gets his gun, his man card reissued. And this just seems to be like, why? This seems to cater to the worst kind of impulses around guns.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, I mean, this is like something that I don't understand. Power changes people, okay? I grew up in a situation where it was not unlikely that you might have an interaction in the street that might end violently. If you put a gun on my hip, I would think that I would be much more likely to escalate, to say things that maybe I would not say. We know that if you are driving a car, we certainly have behaviors that we will exhibit behind the safety of a wheel that we would not exhibit as pedestrians or if we were riding a bike.
I'm slightly more profane driving my car than hosting my show.
Let me jump in here.
I mean, I think that ad is a real manifestation of that.
Rich,
Let me jump in here. You've not carried a gun on your hip. I do. Okay, and I can tell you that in my case, it causes me to de-escalate every situation. And the reason is that if I get into an altercation with you, what am I going to do? I'm going to go fisticuffs with you with a .45 on my hip and go to ground? I'm certainly not intending to shoot you. So,
well, you know, the thing is that I think
we de-escalate in those situations.
Right.
Well,
I'm sure that
I guess I don't think we can legislate. I mean, I certainly would agree that you are someone of perhaps a really responsible disposition, right? But we can't legislate for the best case
I have
scenario.
A temper like everybody else.
Right, but you just talked about, here's my question. You talked about training before, right? About knowing what you're doing with these items that you've purchased. And I got this interesting email from a viewer who was talking about the difference in the state that he was in between. He has a commercial driver's license. He was talking about the amount of regulation to maintain a commercial driver's license. Now, this is just to drive around the van that essentially he runs his small business with. And it was like every 6 months you got to come in, you have to pass a competency test. You constantly have to be like, and all he's doing is driving around a van that he uses to run his small business. And there's this very high standard for how to say to essentially society and through the law that you are worthy of the ability to do this thing. And one can imagine some kind of world in which the training you're talking about was actually legally checked. What would be wrong with that?
Well, I think that it's a discussion for an entire second show. What would be wrong with that? First of all, it would require registration of every gun owner in this country, which is against which has been
constitutionally odious.
Yeah, I mean, you enter the slippery slope right there. I think that
why do we have to register cars and have insurance, and we should not?
Because it's a privilege. Because in our law, that is considered a privilege to allow you to drive. It is not a privilege to allow you to own a gun. It is a constitutionally guaranteed right in the Bill of Rights, which tells you that it doesn't even come from the government.
But from a moral perspective, I mean, that doesn't bother you at all? I mean, a gun is intended to end a life, maybe not a human life.
No, a hatchet or a machete does the same. Look at China. Look at what they're doing to school kids in China today with edged weapons. Do we register those?
Although the lethality there is quite different.
The lethality? How many were killed most recently in China?
No, 27 were stabbed, and they all survived.
No, there was.
Although they have other lethal ones as well. There's been this weird outbreak.
There have been several multiple killings with edged weapons.
We're going to return this topic tomorrow. We're going to talk about regulation, but I would love to have you both back at the table, and you guys as well. Ta-Nehisi Coates from the Atlantic magazine, writer Haley Elkins, Rich Lucibella from S.W.A.T magazine, Survival Weapons and Tactics, and Jackie Hilley from New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. Thank you again.